Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Mississippi. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing what places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1843, when Gideon Hale returned unexpectedly to Magnolia Ridge, his plantation 20 miles south of Natchez. The autumn air carried a strange stillness that evening. According to county records, Hale had been away for 3 weeks on business in New Orleans, a trip that should have lasted another 10 days. No explanation for his early return was ever documented. The carriage driver, a man identified only as Samuel in the Hale household ledger, later told a newspaper correspondent that his master had been unusually quiet during the 2-day journey home. The same ledger shows that Samuel was sold to a plantation in Louisiana just 2 weeks after these events. What happened at Magnolia Ridge that October night would remain largely unspoken for decades. The official account, as recorded in the Adams County Register, mentioned only that an incident involving a household member required medical attention. No doctor's records exist from that night. No official inquiry was ever conducted. Yet by 1844, the Hale name had become whispered about in parlors across Mississippi and Louisiana, not with the reverence once afforded to one of the wealthiest cotton producers in the state, but with hushed speculation. The Hale family had arrived in Mississippi 22 years earlier, when the cotton boom was transforming the landscape. Gideon Hale, then a young man of 23, with an inheritance from his Virginia tobacco farming father, purchased 800 acres of prime Mississippi soil. According to property deeds from 1821, he initially acquired 12 enslaved persons to work his land. By 1843, county tax records show his property had expanded to 126 people and over 2,000 acres. Celeste Moreau became Gideon Hale's wife in the spring of 1838. She was the daughter of a French-born New Orleans merchant and, by all accounts preserved in local society columns, was considered a great beauty. The marriage united old Virginia money with new Louisiana commerce. Their wedding was documented as the social event of the season in the Natchez Courier. The couple had no children, a fact noted with increasing frequency in Celeste's correspondence with her sister in New Orleans as the years passed. Life at Magnolia Ridge followed the rhythms common to large plantations of the era. The main house stood on a gentle rise, its white columns visible from the county road. Behind it stretched the working quarters, the cotton gin, and the fields that made the Hales wealthy. Church records show the Hales attended St. Mary's Episcopal in Natchez twice monthly. Gideon's signature appears on numerous civic documents and business contracts throughout the region. Celeste's name appears less frequently, primarily on charity committee rosters for the Natchez Ladies Benevolent Society. What distinguished the Hales from their neighbors, according to correspondence between local planters preserved in the state historical archives, was Gideon's reputation for maintaining unusually orderly operations. One letter from a neighboring plantation owner to his brother in Charleston noted, "Hale runs his fields with the precision of a military regiment, no excess violence, but no mercy for idleness either." This calculated efficiency had made him one of the most successful planters in the region. Among the 126 enslaved individuals at Magnolia Ridge, tax records list a man called Solomon, aged approximately 60 years in 1843. He had been among Gideon's initial purchase in 1821. Plantation ledgers describe him as a skilled carpenter. Records indicate he had constructed most of the furniture in the main house, the overseer's cottage, and even pieces sold to other plantation owners in the area. A bill of sale to a visiting Tennessee planter describes a desk made by the skilled Negro artisan Solomon. that sold for a considerable sum. According to household accounts maintained by Celeste, Solomon's wife Ruth served as the head cook at Magnolia Ridge. Their 3 adult children had been sold to other plantations years earlier, a common practice that left no family unit intact. This information comes from an inventory list dated 1835 with a notation that the sale brought in $2,400 used to expand the main house's east wing. The events of October 12, 1843 remain largely undocumented in official records. What we know comes primarily from fragments, notations in Hale's personal journal discovered during the renovation of Magnolia Ridge in 1963, a series of letters between Celeste and her sister in New Orleans, and accounts collected by a journalist for the New Orleans Picayune who visited Adams County in 1869, long after the Hales had departed the area. According to these pieced-together accounts, Gideon Hale returned home unexpectedly that Thursday evening, around 7 o'clock. The main house was lit as usual. No commotion or disorder was apparent from the exterior. Samuel, the carriage driver, took the horses to the stable while Gideon entered through the front door, apparently without announcing his arrival. What he witnessed in the kitchen at the rear of the house is described only obliquely in his journal. Found C. In a state beyond reason, the old carpenter on the floor, unspeakable, Dr. Matthews summoned from town. Another entry dated 2 days later notes, Ruth, inconsolable, separated her from the others. And then, 5 days after that, discussion with Wilkins about sale of western section, must leave this place. Celeste's correspondence with her sister, preserved in the archives of a New Orleans Historical Society, abruptly ceased after September 1843. When it resumed in December, she was writing from Charleston, South Carolina. She made no mention of Mississippi or the events at Magnolia Ridge. Her only reference to the past was a cryptic line, I find myself much recovered from the nervous affliction that troubled me in our former residence. The sea air agrees with me. From the journalist's investigation published in 1869, we learn more details, though how accurate they remain after 26 years is questionable. According to this account, several house servants reported that Celeste Moreau Hale had, over the course of several months in 1843, exhibited increasing agitation about deficiencies in the household. She reportedly complained often that items were not properly maintained, that meals were not precisely to her liking, and that the furniture Solomon had crafted was showing signs of wear that reflected poorly on the household. The same article states that on the evening of October 12th, Celeste had entered the kitchen while Ruth was preparing the evening meal. She had reportedly found fault with something. Accounts differ on whether it was the temperature of the food or the arrangement of the table settings. Solomon, who was repairing a chair in an adjacent room, allegedly came to his wife's defense. What happened next is described in the newspaper account through second-hand testimony. Celeste, in what was characterized as a fit of hysteria, took a pot of boiling water from the kitchen fire and poured it over Solomon. He fell to the floor with severe burns. It was at this moment, according to the article, that Gideon Hale entered the house and discovered the scene. No medical records exist detailing Solomon's injuries. The only official document referencing the event is a notation in the Adams County Death Register, which lists the death of male Negro, property of G. Hale, on October 15, 1843. The cause is listed simply as misadventure. What makes the aftermath of this event so unusual for the time and place was not the violence itself. Such acts against enslaved people were tragically common and rarely documented, but rather its effect on Gideon Hale. According to property records, Hale began selling portions of Magnolia Ridge within weeks of the incident. By January 1844, he had liquidated most of his Mississippi holdings. The plantation was divided and sold to 3 different buyers. More curious still is the fact that, according to a Charleston directory from 1844, Gideon and Celeste Hale took up residence in South Carolina, but apparently lived in separate homes on the same street. A small note in a Charleston Society column from 1845 mentions that Mrs. Hale entertains frequently, though her husband is rarely in attendance, citing business concerns that keep him traveling. Ruth's fate after Magnolia Ridge is documented only through a single church record from 1847. The First African Baptist Church of Natchez lists a Sister Ruth, formerly of the Hale Plantation, as having received charity from the congregation's benevolence fund. The record notes she was advanced in years and without family nearby. Perhaps the most disturbing document related to these events emerged in 1962, when a history professor from the University of Mississippi was researching plantation economies. In the personal papers of Thomas Wilkins, who purchased the western section of Magnolia Ridge, he discovered a sealed letter from Gideon Hale, dated November 1843. The letter had apparently never been sent. Its contents were published in a limited academic journal in 1963. The letter reads, in part, "What I witnessed cannot be reconciled with Christian conscience nor natural feeling. That such cruelty could exist within my own household, indeed within my own marriage, has caused me to question all that I believed about our way of life. Solomon crafted the very chair in which I now sit to write this letter. His hands built much of what we called our civilization here. The way he looked at me as he lay dying, not with hatred but with a profound disappointment, will haunt me until my own death." The document continues, "I have begun to see shadows, where before I saw only the natural order of things. The cries from the quarters that I once ignored now keep me awake. I find I cannot look our people in the eye, for I see in them the silent accusation that I allowed this to happen through my own willful blindness." Celeste speaks of the incident as though discussing a broken teacup, an unfortunate accident, quickly cleaned up and forgotten. "I do not recognize the woman I married." No record exists of Gideon Hale ever returning to Mississippi. Charleston city directories list him as a resident until 1851, after which his name disappears from all public records. A small notice in the Charleston Mercury from September 1851 notes the departure of Mrs. Celeste Hale, widow, on a ship bound for France. No death certificate for Gideon has ever been located. The story of what happened at Magnolia Ridge might have remained buried in fragmented records and fading memories had it not been for a discovery made during highway construction near Natchez in 1966. Workers uncovered a small cemetery that had been unmarked for over a century. Among the graves was one with a simple wooden marker that had somehow survived. The name Solomon had been carved into it, along with the dates circa 1783-1843 and the words Master Builder. Historians later determined that this cemetery had been established by the formerly enslaved community that remained in the area after emancipation. According to oral histories collected from descendants of those who had lived at Magnolia Ridge, the story of what had happened to Solomon had been passed down through generations, not as a singular atrocity, but as one terrible example of the system's inhumanity. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of this story is what it reveals about the nature of the antebellum South. While the violence against Solomon was shocking enough to cause Gideon Hale to abandon his way of life, it was not shocking enough to prompt any legal action or public outcry at the time. The event was hushed up, handled privately, its ripple effects contained within property transactions and relocated households. The plantation house at Magnolia Ridge burned to the ground in 1872, long after the Hales had departed. Local newspaper accounts attributed the fire to lightning, though rumors persisted that it was deliberately set. The land was eventually divided into smaller farms. Today, nothing remains of the original structures. In 1959, a graduate student at Fisk University conducted interviews with several elderly residents of Adams County whose grandparents had been enslaved at various plantations in the area. One woman, aged 94 at the time of the interview, recalled her grandmother speaking of Miss Celeste and the terrible business with the water. The transcript notes that the woman would not elaborate further, saying only, "Some stories are best left untold, but never forgotten." What makes the case of Magnolia Ridge particularly disturbing is not just the violence itself, but the silence that surrounded it. The way that even an act that shocked the conscience of a hardened plantation owner could be absorbed into the fabric of society without causing it to tear. The story speaks to the poisonous nature of a system that corrupted not only those who built it and profited from it, but those who were brought into it, like Celeste Moreau, the merchant's daughter from New Orleans. A final note about this case comes from an unexpected source. In the collection of the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, there is a small wooden box that was donated anonymously in 1968. Inside is a necklace of simple design, a carved wooden pendant on a leather cord. According to the accession notes, a letter accompanied the donation stating that the pendant had been carved by an enslaved artisan named Solomon for his wife Ruth. It had been preserved by their descendants for over a century. The pendant bears a simple design, two intertwined circles. When examined by art historians, they determined it to be a West African symbol representing eternal love. How this personal item survived when families were routinely torn apart, when human beings were treated as property, and when an entire society conspired to erase their humanity, remains one of the most profound mysteries of this disturbing case. The events at Magnolia Ridge serve as a dark reminder of our nation's past, not as an isolated incident of cruelty, but as a window into the daily reality of a society built on fundamental injustice. The fact that we know of this case at all is unusual. For every documented atrocity, countless others were never recorded, their victims remembered only in the oral histories of those who survived, if at all. What happened to Celeste Moreau after she departed for France remains unknown. No further records of her have been discovered in American archives. Whether she ever acknowledged the horror of her actions or faced any kind of reckoning for them is lost to history. Gideon Hale's fate is equally obscure, though the absence of a death record has led some historians to speculate that he may have changed his name and started a new life elsewhere, haunted by what he had witnessed and his own complicity in the system that made it possible. The land where Magnolia Ridge once stood is now part of a national forest. Nothing remains to indicate the wealth that was once extracted from its soil or the lives that were crushed to produce it. Only in archives, fragmentary records, and the memories passed down through generations can we find traces of what occurred there in October 1843. Some local residents claim that the area where the plantation house once stood feels colder than the surrounding forest, even on the hottest summer days. Others say they've heard sounds of weeping among the trees. These are, of course, just stories, the way humans attempt to process historical trauma through folklore. But perhaps they also represent an unconscious acknowledgement that the past is never truly buried, that it continues to speak if we are willing to listen. The story of Magnolia Ridge reminds us that history is not just a collection of dates and events, but a living legacy that continues to shape our present. The echoes of what happened there, the brutal act, the shocked witness, the scattered consequences, reverberate through time, challenging us to acknowledge not just the exceptional cruelties of the past, but the everyday horrors that were once accepted as normal. What would compel a woman like Celeste Moreau to commit such an act? What caused Gideon Hale to finally see the immorality of a system he had profited from for decades? These questions have no simple answers. They speak to the complex psychology of power, to the moral corruption that infects even the genteel when they participate in fundamentally unjust systems, and to the possibility, however rare, of moral awakening. The most reliable account we have of Solomon comes not from official documents, but from the oral history of his community. Those who remembered him not as property, but as a human being of extraordinary skill and dignity. According to these accounts, he was a man who maintained his humanity in a system designed to strip it away. His craftsmanship was his resistance, creating beauty in a place of ugliness, permanence in a life of uncertainty. In 1969, when the highway construction near the Magnolia Ridge site was completed, the graves discovered there, including Solomon's, were relocated to a proper cemetery with permanent markers. Each year, according to the caretaker interviewed in 1972, flowers appear on Solomon's grave around October 15th, the anniversary of his death. No one knows who places them there. Perhaps the most important aspect of this story is what it tells us about witnessing. Gideon Hale saw something that he could not unsee, an act so brutal that it stripped away the comfortable lies he had told himself about the system that enriched him. In that moment of witnessing, something fundamental changed. The question for us, as we look back on this history, is whether we too are willing to truly see the past for what it was, without the comforting myths and evasions that make it easier to bear. The story of what happened at Magnolia Ridge in October 1843 is not just about one act of cruelty or one man's moral awakening. It's about the society that made both possible, a society that valued human beings differently based on the color of their skin, that permitted ownership of some people by others, that looked away from daily atrocities until, occasionally, one became impossible to ignore. As we close this account, we should remember that history is always incomplete. The records are fragmentary, the voices of the most vulnerable often absent from the official narrative. What we know about Solomon, Ruth, and the other 124 human beings owned by Gideon Hale comes primarily from property records, tax documents, and sales receipts. The cold bureaucracy of a system that reduced people to entries in a ledger. Yet even through these inadequate sources, their humanity shines through, in the pendant carved for his wife, in the furniture crafted with skill and care, in the community that remembered and honored them long after those who owned them were forgotten. Their resistance was not always dramatic or documented, but it was persistent and profound. The road that now passes near where Magnolia Ridge once stood is traveled by thousands who have no idea of what happened there. The forest has reclaimed the fields where cotton once grew. The memory of that October night lives on, primarily in archives and oral histories, in academic papers and local legends. But perhaps, in some intangible way, it also persists in our national consciousness, a wound that has scarred over but never fully healed. For those who study history, the story of Magnolia Ridge stands as a reminder that behind the grand narratives of wars and presidents, economic systems and social movements, there are individual human lives, people who suffered, resisted, witnessed, and sometimes rarely changed. Their stories, however fragmentary, deserve to be remembered. In the archives of the Mississippi Historical Society, researchers in 1964 uncovered a series of ledgers from a small clinic operated by a Dr. James Matthews near Natchez. These records, water-damaged and partially illegible, contain a cryptic entry dated October 12, 1843. Called to Magnolia Ridge, patient with severe scalding injuries, condition grave, Mrs. H in state of agitation, restrained by household staff, Mr. H requesting laudanum for both. This medical record, overlooked for more than a century, provides the only professional documentation of the immediate aftermath of the incident. Dr. Matthews made 2 subsequent entries regarding visits to Magnolia Ridge on October 13th and 14th, noting in the final entry, only patient succumbed to injuries. No further treatment possible. The doctor's personal journal, discovered among his effects when the clinic building was demolished in 1958, contains a more revealing passage. I have witnessed many cruel acts in my 20 years of practicing medicine in this county, but the scene at Magnolia Ridge surpasses understanding. That a gentlewoman of Mrs. Hale's standing could commit such an act defies explanation. Mr. Hale seems broken by what has occurred. He spoke of leaving the county altogether. I advised him that distance alone cannot heal such wounds of the spirit. According to tax records from 1844, Gideon Hale did indeed sell most of his human property before departing Mississippi. What distinguishes these sales from typical transactions of the era is a curious pattern noted by economic historians studying the documents. Unlike most plantation owners who sold enslaved people to maximize profit, often separating families in the process, Hale appeared to sell family units intact whenever possible. Most notably, the sale document for Ruth, Solomon's widow, indicates she was purchased by the same family that had bought her youngest son 8 years earlier. This unusual consideration has been interpreted by some historians as evidence of Gideon Hale's moral awakening following the incident. Others suggest it may have been an attempt to assuage his guilt. Either way, it represented a significant departure from standard practice in the antebellum cotton economy. A letter discovered in the personal papers of Reverend William Thornton of St. Mary's Episcopal Church in Natchez, dated November 1843, offers another glimpse into Gideon Hale's state of mind in the weeks following the incident. The letter, apparently written in response to one from Hale, which has not survived, reads in part, "My dear Mr. Hale, your crisis of conscience is understandable given the shocking circumstances you describe. However, I must caution against drawing too broad a conclusion from this isolated incident. The peculiar institution upon which our society rests is ordained by both law and scripture. That Mrs. Hale acted with excessive passion is regrettable, but does not invalidate the natural order. I urge you to seek reconciliation with Mrs. Hale and resume your Christian duties as master of your household. Many depend upon your guidance and authority." There is no record of Gideon Hale's response to this pastoral counsel, though his actions, selling the plantation and leaving the state, suggest he rejected it entirely. Celeste Moreau Hale's perspective on these events is largely absent from historical records. No personal journals or letters written by her immediately following the incident have been discovered. Her correspondence with her sister, as previously noted, resumed only after she had relocated to Charleston and makes no direct reference to what happened at Magnolia Ridge. However, in 1966, during the cataloguing of materials from the Moreau family papers donated to the Louisiana Historical Association, archivists discovered a letter from Celeste to her father, dated December 1843. The letter, written in French, contains a passage that may allude to the incident. "Papa, you raised me to believe that our position in society was natural and just, that those beneath us were placed there by Providence, and that our authority over them was both our right and our burden. I performed my duties as mistress of a great household according to these principles. That Gideon now abandons these principles because of one unfortunate incident with an insolent servant shows a weakness of character I could not have anticipated when we married. He speaks of things he cannot possibly understand, of guilt and responsibility, as though we have done something contrary to nature. I cannot follow him down this path of madness." This rare glimpse into Celeste's thinking suggests she viewed her actions not as a moral failing, but as a regrettable but legitimate exercise of her authority as a plantation mistress. Her characterization of Solomon as insolent offers the only hint of what might have precipitated the violence, a challenge, however mild, to her authority. The journey of this narrative from private tragedy to historical record followed a circuitous path. For nearly a century, what happened at Magnolia Ridge remained known only to those directly involved and perhaps a small circle of local gossips. The story might have been lost entirely had it not been for a series of coincidental discoveries and the persistence of oral tradition among the descendants of those who had been enslaved at Magnolia Ridge. In 1955, a professor of American history at Tougaloo College began collecting oral histories from elderly black residents of Adams County. Among these was an interview with Martha Johnson, then 87 years old, who related a story told to her by her grandmother about the time Ms. Celeste poured the boiling water and everything changed. The professor included this account in a small monograph published in 1957, though it attracted little attention outside academic circles. The discovery of Gideon Hale's unsent letter to Thomas Wilkins in 1962 provided the first written confirmation of the incident. This led historians to search for additional documentation, resulting in the subsequent discoveries of Dr. Matthews' clinic records, Reverend Thornton's letter, and eventually Celeste's letter to her father. Perhaps the most poignant artifact associated with this case emerged in 1967, when renovations to the First African Baptist Church of Natchez uncovered a small wooden box sealed within a wall cavity. Inside was a folded piece of paper containing a lock of hair tied with a faded ribbon, along with a note in careful handwriting. Solomon, called home, October 15th, 1843. A master craftsman whose hands created beauty even in bondage. May he rest in the freedom he was denied in life. Church records suggest the box was placed there during renovations in 1871 by a congregation that included several people formerly enslaved at Magnolia Ridge. This act of remembrance, hidden from public view but preserved for future generations, speaks to the community's determination that Solomon's story would not be forgotten. In 1968, these various threads were woven together in a scholarly article published in the Journal of Southern History titled Moral Awakening on a Mississippi Plantation, The Case of Gideon Hale. The article attracted attention from other historians researching the psychological and moral dimensions of slaveholding in the antebellum South. By 1969, when the unmarked cemetery near the former Magnolia Ridge plantation was discovered during highway construction, enough was known about the case that archaeologists and historians took special note of Solomon's grave. The wooden marker, remarkably preserved in the humid Mississippi climate, was removed for conservation and eventually placed in the collection of the State Historical Museum. What makes this case particularly valuable to historians is the rare documentation of a psychological turning point, a moment when a beneficiary of the slave system was confronted with its moral horror in a way he could no longer ignore or rationalize. While abolitionists of the era often appealed to slaveholders' conscience, there are few well-documented cases of such appeals succeeding, especially among wealthy cotton planters with substantial investments in human property. Gideon Hale's transformation from enthusiastic participant in the slave economy to someone who apparently could no longer bear to participate in it offers a window into the complex psychology of the slave-holding class. It suggests that even those deeply implicated in the system sometimes harbored doubts about its morality, doubts that could, under the right circumstances, erupt into a full moral crisis. However, it is equally important to note what the Magnolia Ridge incident reveals about the limitations of individual moral awakening in the face of entrenched systems of oppression. Gideon Hale may have experienced a crisis of conscience, but his response was private withdrawal rather than public opposition. He sold his plantation and moved away. He did not become an abolitionist or speak out against slavery. His moral revelation changed his personal circumstances, but did not challenge the system itself. This pattern, recognition of injustice followed by personal disengagement rather than systemic challenge, has parallels throughout American history. It reminds us that moral clarity alone, without corresponding political action, may ease individual conscience, but does little to dismantle unjust institutions. Celeste Moreau. Hale's perspective, glimpsed briefly through her letter to her father, provides an equally important insight into how beneficiaries of oppressive systems justify their actions. Her inability to see anything fundamentally wrong with her treatment of Solomon, viewing it instead as perhaps an unfortunate excess of legitimate authority, illustrates how thoroughly the ideology of white supremacy could warp moral perception. Her dismissal of Gideon's moral concerns as madness reflects a common response to challenges of the status quo, the pathologizing of moral dissent. Rather than engaging with his ethical qualms, she frames them as mental instability, a failure of manhood, or a betrayal of their class position. This rhetorical strategy has been employed throughout history to discredit those who question established hierarchies. The fragmentary nature of the historical record surrounding the Magnolia Ridge incident also serves as a reminder of how much of the past, particularly the experiences of the enslaved, remains irrecoverable. We know more about Gideon and Celeste Hale's responses to the incident than we do about Solomon's life before it or Ruth's life after it. Their interior lives, hopes, fears, and perspectives are largely absent from written sources, preserved only in the oral traditions of their descendants and in the material evidence of Solomon's craftsmanship. This asymmetry in the historical record reflects the power dynamics of the society that produced it, a society that extensively documented property transactions but rarely recorded the humanity of those classified as property. It challenges historians and audiences alike to read against the grain of available sources, to recognize the silences in the archives as themselves evidence of historical injustice. In 1972, the Mississippi Department of Archives and History commissioned an artist to create illustrations of furniture designs based on descriptions of Solomon's work found in sales records and household inventories. These drawings, while speculative, attempt to recover something of his creative vision and technical skill. They represent one small effort to restore agency and individuality to a historical figure whose humanity was denied in his lifetime. The Magnolia Ridge incident has occasionally been cited by psychological researchers studying the phenomenon known as moral injury, the trauma that results from perpetrating, witnessing, or failing to prevent acts that violate one's core moral beliefs. Gideon Hale's response to witnessing his wife's cruelty, his apparent inability to continue living as before, his withdrawal from society, his possible change of identity, fits the pattern of severe moral injury described in modern psychological literature. This framework helps us understand his behavior not simply as an intellectual change of opinion, but as a profound psychological wound, one that may never have healed. The fact that he disappears from historical records after 1851, leaving Celeste to identify herself as a widow, suggests he may have chosen to completely reinvent himself, to become someone else, rather than continue as the man who had owned Magnolia Ridge. In this light, his earlier actions as a plantation owner, his reputation for orderly operations and efficiency, his avoidance of excess violence, take on a different meaning. They can be seen as attempts to maintain a moral self-image within an inherently immoral system, a psychological balancing act that became impossible to sustain after witnessing the brutality at the core of that system, stripped of all pretense of paternalism or necessity. Solomon's death thus becomes not merely a personal tragedy, but a moment of revelation. For Gideon, for the wider community that heard whispers of what had happened, and for us as historical witnesses across time. It reveals both the spectacular cruelty possible within the slave system and the elaborate psychological architecture that normally kept that cruelty hidden from those who benefited from it. The wooden pendant found in the anonymously donated box in 1968, the one Solomon carved for Ruth with its symbol of eternal love, stands as perhaps the most powerful artifact associated with this case. It reminds us that even within a system designed to deny the humanity of the enslaved, to prevent the formation and maintenance of family bonds, individuals found ways to express love, to create beauty, and to preserve their essential humanity. That this small object survived for over a century, passed down through generations, speaks to the resilience of those connections and to the importance of memory as a form of resistance. When official records categorize Solomon only as property, his descendants remembered him as a husband, a father, an artist, a human being worthy of love and remembrance. Today, this pendant is displayed in the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum in Jackson, alongside other artifacts that tell the story of resistance to oppression throughout the state's history. Its simple design, two interlinked circles, has become a symbol used in educational materials about the history of slavery and its legacy in America. The events at Magnolia Ridge in October 1843 may have been exceptional in some respects, particularly in their documentation and their effect on Gideon Hale, but they were also tragically common. Violence against enslaved people was an everyday reality on plantations across the South. What made this incident noteworthy, both at the time and for historians later, was not its uniqueness, but rather the reaction it provoked in a member of the slaveholding class. This focus raises uncomfortable questions about historical attention and value. Do we care about Solomon's suffering primarily because of its effect on Gideon Hale? Does our historical interest inadvertently center the moral journey of the oppressor rather than the experience of the oppressed? These questions have no easy answers, but they demand consideration as we engage with this and similar historical narratives. Perhaps the most appropriate way to conclude this account is not with further speculation about Gideon or Celeste Hale's fate, but with what little we know about Ruth's life after Magnolia Ridge. According to a brief mention in church records from 1848, she was reunited with her youngest son when Gideon sold her to the family that had purchased him years earlier. A census record from 1850 shows her living in a household with several other formerly enslaved individuals near Port Gibson, Mississippi. The final historical trace of her comes from a Freedmen's Bureau record dated 1866. At that time, approximately 23 years after Solomon's death, Ruth was recorded as aged about 75, formerly enslaved, seeking information about adult children sold to Alabama. The record notes that she brought with her a wooden ornament said to be made by her late husband to help identify her to her long-lost children. Whether this search was successful is not recorded. Like so many families torn apart by slavery, Ruth's may never have been fully reunited. But her act of continuing to search, of using Solomon's craftsmanship as a token of connection and recognition, speaks to the enduring bonds that the slave system tried but failed to destroy. In the end, the story of what happened at Magnolia Ridge in 1843 is not just about a moment of violence or a crisis of conscience. It's about the human capacity for both cruelty and moral awakening, for both oppression and resistance. It reminds us that history is not an abstraction, but a collection of human lives, lives shaped by systems larger than themselves, yet never fully determined by those systems. As the ancient wooden marker on Solomon's grave quietly proclaimed, he was a master builder. In a world that denied him mastery even of his own body, he created works of beauty and permanence. In a system designed to reduce him to property, he maintained his dignity and humanity. His story, fragmentary though it is in the historical record, challenges us to see beyond the categories imposed by oppressive systems to the full humanity of those they sought to diminish. Today, the land where Magnolia Ridge once stood bears no visible trace of what happened there. The forest has reclaimed the fields, the buildings have long since disappeared, yet the story remains in archives and museums, in scholarly works and oral traditions, and now in this account. It stands as a testament to the importance of remembering even the most difficult aspects of our past, not to assign blame, but to recognize the full humanity of those who came before us, both those who suffered injustice and those who perpetrated or benefited from it. For in understanding the complex moral terrain of our history, we may better navigate the ethical challenges of our present. In recognizing how thoroughly systems of oppression can warp even good people's moral perception, we may be more vigilant about our own moral blind spots. And in acknowledging the resilience and humanity of those who endured the unendurable, we may find inspiration for our own struggles against injustice. The story of Solomon, Ruth, Gideon and Celeste at Magnolia Ridge in 1843 is not just a historical curiosity. It is a mirror in which we might glimpse reflections of our own moral possibilities and failures, a reminder that the past is never truly past, but continues to shape who we are and who we might become.